I have the great privilege of introducing Dr. Mike Pitlick, who just recently finished his thesis on, it's called Imagining David Through the Lens of Archaeology and Jewish Tradition, and it seems like many years of struggle there, but many hot summers out excavating. That's right. He is a visiting instructor in anthropology and the director of Jewish Studies at Oakland University. He's excavated a number of biblical sites and more recent sites in Israel, and as well takes students from Oakland to Israel each year to excavate at a site attributed to the time of King David and other biblical sites. I also have the privilege of going and excavating some of those with him as well. He has a bachelor's degree in history and philosophy, a doctorate in Jewish studies. And it's just an all-around wonderful guy. So please put your hands together.
Thank you. Thanks, Alex. I've been teaching at Oakland University since 2009, and I must say this is the first time I've actually been to an event where a student was actually in charge of something in the field that he's doing. So this is really, really cool. This is really very, very nice. So we have a title there with some descriptions of what we're going to talk about, but just within that first couple lines at the top, you see we have some strange words. So I think what we should do is just put the context here a little bit. First of all, we have Khirbet. Khirbet in Arabic means a ruin. So it's the ruins of a place named called Kaiafa. Happens to be in the state of Israel, in the nation of Israel. And we're digging biblical sha'araim. So already we have a second word, sha'araim. We'll explain what that means and why that's important, actually. And it's an Iron Age site, and Alex printed off for you some of the major periods from the site here. So even though we'll talk about them, at least you can refer to this as we go through. Because we'll be talking mostly about the Iron Age and what that means. And a site from the time of King David. So let me just ask you, let's start off with one thing. Who thinks, there's no right or wrong answer here, please vote your conscience. Who thinks that David was really a real person? And who thinks he was not a real person? Okay. Those of you who wish to say something, why he was a real person, how do you know that? Okay?
Well, partly because I've read on different archaeological digs that they found besides this.
Okay. So the sites that you read about, if you can remember, maybe not the specific details of them, but did they actually find David? It's a silly question, obviously, but so how do we know that's David? Or from the time of David? Ah. Anybody else?
We think there's enough history in the Bible that there was a David, there was a king.
So the tradition.
Yeah.
There's a tradition for a reason, right? So if you want to read a really interesting book, all of a sudden David is huge, or maybe it's just because I've been dealing with David for 7 years. But if you want to read an interesting book that just came out last year, it's called King David. It's by Joel Baden, B-A-D-E-N. And it's a really interesting read. He does not use any archaeology or very, very little, and he proves that David, according to him, proves that David is a real person. So somebody put up their hand that they don't think David was a real person. Is there a particular reason why, or? You need more proof, or what?
I need more proof, yeah.
Okay.
There are too many things in the Old Testament that are not congruous.
Okay, that's a very fair point. So,
Everybody in the room who hates me.
no. Actually, it's a very important point because there are a lot of different stories about David. And some of the stories that have continued about David are not that flattering. So Joel Baden, in that book I just discussed, just mentioned to you, actually will go into the story about why it is that the bad stories about David are still in the Bible. For example, you've all heard of the Bathsheba affair and what he did in that event and what he did with conquering certain places and killing certain people. And all of a sudden, there always seems to be the Bible doing backflips to try to justify or apologize for David. In other words, what this author is saying is that because of that, there must have been a real story they were trying to apologize for. So the picture we get at the end of that book is David probably wasn't the Michelangelo type with the flowing locks and the great demeanor and all that sort of thing. He was a king suitable for the Iron Age. In other words, he had a big task. He had to unite a people, or he tried to unite a people. He developed a kingdom where there was none before. And so when we go and we digging up biblical Sha'araim, when we're digging up things like this, we need to find certain fingerprints of the things that are attributed to this king. For example, if he created a state, we should be able to see state stuff. We should be able to see forts. We should be able to see a capital, perhaps. We should be able to see infrastructure of some kind. So when we say we're digging the time of King David, personally, that's about as far as I can go with this. I think he was a real person, but archaeology alone, unless we have an inscription or unless we find a body or unless we see something definitive, but there are a few of those things. And that's very nice for us. In fact, we have a few inscriptions, two inscriptions mentioning David that were from outside the kingdom of Israel, which gives us more evidence that somebody else realized there was a David. Now, it comes after David's time, and we'll talk about that for a minute. Now, all right, so apparently most of you familiar with the Bible, have read some stories. You probably realize that besides the zillions of names and genealogies and things like this that appear, there's also a lot of place names. A lot. Dozens and dozens, hundreds. And this patriarch went to this place, or this king went here and he conquered this, and so-and-so walked to this town and then he walked to that town. You get a lot of different places in the Bible. Now, some of these places are over now, 2,000 years old, 4,000 years old, 5,000 years old. And the land of Israel has gone through so many changes, and some of those sites have just been covered up. We don't know where they are. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. So what you're seeing here is a picture. I think it was from 2012. Well, we dug with Oakland University from 2009 until 2013. And Hebrew University, who we partner with in Israel, dug 2 seasons before we got there. And I'll explain what brought us there. But you can imagine that 4,000 years or so or more of history would be pretty thick, right? There'd be a lot of accumulation, things like this. In America, we're not used to this sort of thing. In Israel and in the Middle East, we have these tells. They're called tells. They're big hills. In Hebrew, a tell means hill. So you have these mounds that have many, many layers on them. This site, luckily for us, and it was on purpose that we chose this site, is very shallow. So what you're seeing there, the people standing in those excavation squares, are already, and you see the surface, they're already in the Iron Age of 1000 BC. It's that shallow in some places. So as Alex knows, and all the students who have gone before, and some of those are from other universities, there are places at that particular site where we can dig down in the space of about an hour and a half, and we're in 1000 BC. That's very unusual in Israel. Okay? Sometimes it takes 10 years. If you have a lot of accumulation, Roman and all these Greek and all these other things, and you're trying to get down to a layer down here, so you have a lot of work to do. So we're very, very fortunate about that. So thank you for coming. That was the entire slide. No. All right, so this program, we're very fortunate, very, very fortunate. This is a unique program that we have been able to grow. And it started basically when I came back from Israel on a trip in 2008. And I landed and went home and collapsed. Before I collapsed, I checked the news. And I was still smelling like Delta Airlines when I got in the house. I still had jet lag. And I turned to look at the news and I saw inscription found in Israel, dating to the time of King David. And it mentions all these different things. And how did I miss that? I was just there. And I read a little bit about it, and before I passed out, I said, I'm going there. And this was 2008, before I started at Oakland University. So divine intervention comes into play here someplace. I had been teaching at the Jewish Federation in archaeology and biblical history and so on. And I had heard through the grapevine when I was at my synagogue just down the road this way, somebody who was teaching at Oakland part-time said, they're hiring at Oakland, you might want to call them and see what they're doing. Okay, so I had an appointment and I had a lunch and I talked about archaeology, and they said, the woman hiring me said, we've been looking for someone to take our students to Israel. Do you know of a dig? And I said, I do. So the next year, We started the process in January of 2009. We were in Israel in June. It happened. That's fast for a university to turn around. And the first year we were 100% funded by donors. So the students went with no cost. It was amazing. So we work now, this is going on our 7th year, unbelievable. We work in the Judaic Studies Department in Oakland and also the Anthropology Department together, and we partner with Hebrew University out of Jerusalem. Okay? Actually, Hebrew University was founded by Americans, actually, back in the 1920s. Okay. Now, this will be probably the most complex slide, so as time goes on, it'll get easier. What do we have here? We're talking about 2 very important periods in Israel's history. The first one, the Iron Age 1, is rather short archaeologically, just 200 years or so. In those 200 years, we see some unique forces that come to play that actually cause, or we see the emergence of, what we can finally identify as Israelites. They're living in the middle of the country, in the Central Hill Country, Jerusalem and north, and they're starting to display unique characteristics of an ethnicity. That's a very difficult thing to find in archaeology, ethnicity. It's a very difficult thing to dig up. But we start to see telltale characteristics of their material culture that we can say with certainty that after that particular period, those traits continued on well into the Jewish periods that we know very well. Okay? So in the Iron Age 1, those 200 years, the people are forming. If you want to get a picture of this particular period, read the book of Judges. It's not to be taken at 100% face value, but it is quite interesting how it talks about the way they organized themselves and where they were living and what the problems they faced, and we'll discuss some of them. The problems they faced actually helped them create their own identity, in a sense. Now, after that, in the book of Judges, it says no fewer than 6 times, in those days there was no king over us. And because they didn't want a king, they had judges among the tribes. They didn't want a king because they thought in their minds they had one king, and that was a heavenly king, and they had a covenant, and they were going to be taken care of, and etc. But some unique forces happened, such as the arrival of the Philistines. That's one thing. And also, so by the get to the end of the book of Judges, it says, we want a king over us. Specifically, it says, because we want him to fight our battles for us, because we're tired of fighting them ourselves. We need to organize. So, when we get to that magical, quasi-magical number of 1000 BC, we have a new period. And the new period is the Iron Age 2. And on your sheet here it says, what does that mean in Israel? That means that we have the beginning of the state, a state. Things changed. We have a capital, we have historical records that we can trace back to about that particular time. Now, biblical chronology is sort of different than regular chronology in a sense because we have to take certain things that happened in certain kings and apply them to other dates that we know, say, for example, from Mesopotamia or for Egypt. Now, we have to back up, and it takes a while to get things straightened out biblically in chronology. David was always assumed to have lived around 1000 BC. So that's where we start. Now, archaeology can confirm or deny that, but again, without a body, without a skeleton that says David, it's very difficult to say we have David. Okay, so we must keep that in mind. But some other things are going on. At the far side over here on the left, you see at 1206, the word Israel is used for the very first time from an inscription on that stele that stands taller than me, actually. It's in the Egyptian Museum today in Cairo that says at the very bottom of it, it says, the king boasts, from Egypt, boasts that he took over certain cities within the land of Israel, land of Canaan actually. And at the bottom of that he says, I struck this city down and I took this city and I defeated this place, but I also eradicated a people called Israel. That's the first anchor that we have, that there's something, some entity, some people called Israel, known by an outside nation, outside the Bible. Now for some people who really want the facts and really want to not use the Bible to get at those facts, this was a watershed, in other words. The Bible is its own propaganda, it's its own story, it's not necessarily history, it can be, but it's not pure history. But this helps us a lot. So 1206, the Egyptians say, we have a people in Israel known as Israelites. So we move along down the line. The next major event affecting all of this in these important periods is the arrival of the Philistines. They are one group among many of the sea peoples. There's a whole transition going on in the wider Mediterranean. It just doesn't affect Israel or Egypt, but around 1200 or so, all the way to about 1177 specifically, there is an upheaval in the Near East, around the Mediterranean basin. It starts way back in Greece and in Turkey and moves towards Egypt. Everything's upside down. Earthquakes perhaps, volcanoes perhaps, famine perhaps, all kinds of different things come together. There is another new book out called 1177, the year everything changed, by Klein, I think his last name is. And he talks about this event, which caused a number of people to get up and leave their areas, their homelands. So when the Philistines arrive, they arrive first on the shores of Egypt, and the Egyptians battle them. Then they come to settle in modern-day Israel, which would be more or less where we see the Gaza Strip today. Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Tel Safi, or biblical Gat. That's going to be an important thing for us, G-A-T-H. It's very interesting that this word Philistines then is picked up later, much later by the Romans, and we have Palestine. That's where we get that word, by the way, just FYI. They arrive. Who knows anything about the Philistines? Tell me one thing, adjectives, whatever.
Giant.
That's right, absolutely, giants. How do we know that? How do we know that?
Isn't that David and Goliath?
One story, yep. So when we dig up Philistines, by the way, they don't seem any bigger, but what else do we know about them? What does the Bible say? Does it like the Philistines?
No.
Why not?
They were enemies of Israel.
Right. It's actually a derogatory adjective, isn't it? When you say somebody's a Philistine. Crude, backward, brutish, violent. Guess what? It's the opposite of that. The Bible's got an agenda here. Okay? They came to settle. And the reason why they came to settle, we think, is because of all those events that happened prior. They were looking for a new homeland. Why do we know that? Because the depictions of the Egyptians shows us what these guys came with on their boats and overland. They came with boats, pigs, cattle, women, children, household goods, and war stuff. So they were coming to settle. They weren't just going to conquer lands, although they were trying to do that. All right? So they are a big issue in this story. Now, from 1200 to about 1000, we have this progression of sites. I'll show you this. I'm going to speed along here because we'll be here till Tuesday if I don't get going. By the time we get towards the 1,000-year mark, and we have to be flexible with that date, okay, a little bit. We've actually think we've moved it back a little bit for David to about 1025 or so. That's debatable, but we'll see how things turn out. Now, you've heard about the kings, the early kings of Israel. Saul. Anybody know about Saul? Poor Saul. What happened to Saul?
He was killed, him and his son.
By?
I forget, was it Philistines?
He actually suffered wounds in a battle with the Philistines. Now, Saul's an interesting character because he's always fighting the Philistines. All the stories about him they're fighting Philistines. He's fighting Philistines. And so he's also trying to unite this ragtag group that doesn't want to be led by a king. And so what happens? He sets up a small little compound in a place north of Jerusalem, but we have excavated. It doesn't look like a kingdom. He's noted as the first king of Israel, but more like a military leader. But he wasn't able to do what David is attributed to have done, which is unite north and south. Israel and Judah become a state. David is extremely cunning in being able to pull this off. He infiltrates into Saul's court. There's a number of intrigues, banditry. There's all kinds of different things about David, including stories that David went and joined the Philistines and then made raids on Judah. But then David is always given a way out. He never really did that, but he may have been a vassal of the Philistines. We may know that now. We'll have to see how that turns out. David united what the two two entities that Saul was not able to do. And he subdued the Philistines, it appears. When we look at the historical records, we look at the wars and all the different things, and where the Philistines were able to move. They tried to come into the inner part of Israel, the land of Israel, but we can trace their material culture, and it was very, very different from the Israelites. So that's a nice thing for us. Solomon took over from David. It's the heyday. It's the golden age. We have trade relations with Saudi Arabia, with Yemen, modern-day Yemen. Trade, lucrative things, ivory, all kinds of luxury goods. That's an indication that we don't have as many wars. And the Bible does not attribute Solomon with dealing with the Philistines at all. So whatever David was able to do, he subdued the Philistines. I don't want to make this all about the Philistines, but these are some of the forces going on here. So in that highlighted section in the middle, we have the united monarchy, David and Solomon. Solomon's dates are there at the end. Now, you see the other in the black box, there's a little strange-looking stone, and I should have brought my pointer, and I forgot it. In 835 BC, about 165 years after David should have lived, we have another very important inscription, and it's called the Tel Dan inscription because that's where it was found, very, very north of Israel. It was a dedicatory plaque that was affixed above a building, and it fell down in antiquity, and it broke into actually three major pieces. In 1993, the first piece was found, beautiful Aramaic script, and the next year, they went back to the same place and they found the rest of it. That's a very unusual thing in archaeology. And when they put it together, they had an inscription that says the king of Syria, who is based in Damascus, this is in the Bible actually, put up this inscription that says, I have defeated so-and-so from the land of Israel, the kingdom this one, and I took this land, and this king was from the house of David. That's our only inscription in what we're going to talk about. There's one other that mentions house of David. These are our two anchors. We have Israelites somehow in the land, 1206 already, and then the house of David. You don't get very much more concrete than that in archaeology, especially 3,000 years ago. Okay? Those are our two anchors. So somewhere in the middle of that mess, there's a David. So let's try to find him. Okay. The difficult problem is, what is an Israelite? How do you know a people by digging them up? What would you say?
Well, if you found any of their religious, like the things that they wore, or something about the Ten Commandments, or the words of the Bible.
Or the tools that they made, and how they made them.
Pottery.
That's a good one. Okay, let's talk about fabrics and things, clothes. Unless you have a depiction on a stone wall or something. We don't have any of that left. What was the other one?
Weapons or the tools?
Could be, if we're lucky enough to have it be anchored to a particular period, but here they really weren't very warlike. So we see arrowheads and things like this, but they're not all that different from Canaanites. There's a clue there, by the way. Pottery. Perfect. Have you taken archaeology classes?
Well, I figured cloth at this point in time is probably disintegrated.
Right. So when you look at these periods that are here, and they're not all that many, pottery is actually first discovered, I guess is the word, manufactured in the land of Israel only from about 7,500 BC. In other places it's already there, but we have pottery in the beginning, 7,500 BC. So who remembers Roseville pottery? Anybody? Or had it in your family? Roseville pottery or Hull pottery? Do you know enough about it? I used to collect it and sell it and resell it and all that, so I know a lot about it. But do you know enough about it that there was a pattern every year? 1936, for example, they came out with fuchsia. Fuchsia flower, they painted on the vases and things like this, beautiful flowers. In 1937, I think it was freesia, and the next year it was magnolia. So there was a pattern every year, but you could always tell it was Roseville by the colors and the shapes and the things like this. But the patterns were different every year. What do we have here in the United States that we could say dates something? Can you, the guys or maybe the ladies in the room, when you're driving down the highway, especially in that crazy week in August, on Woodward, I have friends who can say, that's a 1967 Chevy da-da-da, and that's a 1942 blah, blah, blah. How do you know that? They were there. Could be.
Because it changed every year.
Right, so like take the Mustang, for example, and I am no expert, but on the back part of it, the taillight from year to year might be a little different, or the fin, and people know, with an eye for that, can tell you that just by looking at it. It's the same thing with pottery, right? Pottery changes over time. And we can date, this is how we date it, things mostly, until we get coins and inscriptions and things like this. We date things by pottery. So there is something about the pottery that you said. The pottery will actually help date a particular period, but it doesn't necessarily tell us who it is. Especially the Israelites. Their pottery was very boring, not decorated, not particularly flattery, not particularly flowery, I should say. The Philistines, however, have another whole thing, so that's very nice. They kept things different. So in the late 1980s, there were surface surveys done in the middle part of Israel, and the question was, what do we have there in the particular periods? How do you do a surface survey? That means no digging, but you take a bunch of students, like Israel Finkelstein did, and you walk the middle of the country, and they did hundreds and hundreds of square miles, and they took several years, and they walked from place to place to place. Now, pottery is so prevalent in Israel that it's sitting on top of the ground, so you don't even need to dig. So they would go from place to place and pick up the pottery, and they would look at it, and we do this in Israel. It looks like this, it's Iron Age 2. This one is Middle Bronze Age. This one is Late Bronze Age. So they would go from place to place, but they would add it all up and calculate it all, and they had found that in those little dots there are over 350 new sites that sprung up from 1200 to 1000 BC. It's a new entity in town. They're not building on old Canaanite foundations. They're building something new. They're living in a certain way. They're making very simple compounds. They're living simply. Pastoralism, a little bit of agriculture. And these small sites are limited to this Iron Age period. Khirbet Qeiyafa there, where the green arrow is where we are, where we dug. Now here are some of the forces that happened. The Egyptians, without going into that detail, the Egyptians withdrew. They had controlled this land prior to 1200. Partially they went back home to take care of the Philistine threat. The Philistines, who then settled in this area, you can see what equates to the red area, is where they settled first. Then they spread out, and we think quite legitimately that they were moving further in to take over more land. The only other entity there was this new Israel, this new Israelite entity that we just talked about and the Egyptians were aware of. So they are in that pale green area, and we have border zones set up. And where the interaction occurred is where there was the most possibility of strife and difference. So in anthropological terms, we see where we have culture zones. And they're very strict. They knew where the borders were. So what might you think would be at a border, especially for a new emerging nation by about 1000 BC? Checkpoints, borders, firm borders of some sort. And it's both cultural and military. So we'll look at that. Now you can see in the upper corner, I don't have a lot of slides, those are Philistine pots. When you go to the Aegean or Mycenae from this particular period, they look exactly the same there. So we know where they came from. Those symbols, and you maybe can see them, maybe you can't, birds and squirrels and fish and all kinds of other things, none of that appears on Israelite pottery. It's extremely boring. So when we see a Philistine pot, we know it. Okay? So we see where the extent of their reach. They took their pottery with them, just like we take our stuff with us. All right. So by 1000 BC, we have a transition towards a state. We see from the biblical record it says that. Now, just because the Bible says it, we don't have to believe it face value. We have to look for stuff. So stuff that's going on in Jerusalem that I'm not going to talk about now is very exciting. Because we're finally getting the picture of a clearer picture of what's going on in about 1000 BC. All right. At about 1000 BC, 75% or so I forgot the exact, high, very high percentage, 75% of those rural sites in the middle of the country were abandoned. And they start to move into fewer but larger sites. So there seems to be a press towards urbanization as well that's going on. But it's a difficult question, how we determine the beginning of a state. What does the Bible say about David's kingdom? Is it grandiose? Is it big, small?
Said it would never end.
Yes, that's true. It would never end. But the Bible boasts about his kingdom. It goes from the Euphrates to the Nile. There's no way. Nobody had that at that time. So it's boasting about it. So we have to take the Bible's description, say, of Jerusalem being huge and built up and palaces and all that stuff, and we have to sort of sift out some of that stuff. So we do see an emerging kingdom, but it's small. Okay? At the end of Samuel, they want a king, the book of Samuel. They want a king over them so they can be like the other nations. And so there seems to be a rush towards urbanization. The Philistine threat is there. They have an Israelite consciousness. You can debate what that is. And so now we're going to go to a site that we have identified as Sha'araim, and I'll explain why we call it this. This is the famous Elah Valley in Israel. It's in southwest of Jerusalem, about 15 to 20 miles. You can already see the site in the picture over here as it appeared before it was even excavated. So there's a nice feature right there. We see walls above the ground without digging. So here's Khirbet Qeiyafa, Sha'araim circled. Look how close it is to the sites on the other side of the cultural border. Tel Safi there, on a clear day you can see it from the site. Tel Safi is its modern name, but Gath is its ancient name. Who's from Gath? Anybody remember? This is a church guide, so you should remember our Bible stuff. Goliath. That's his hometown. Okay. Philistia, the plain of Philistia, is a low, descends from the mountains, comes down towards the seacoast. It's very low, very flat. Philistines came, and if they didn't come with, they developed or procured or created chariots. Great for lowlands and flatlands, but not very good in the hill country where the Israelites were. So that was a nice division point right there. Now, biblical sites caught the attention of early explorers, including Americans, as early as the 1830s. So there was this big transition towards rediscovering the Bible and the place names. It became a passion for Germans and English and the United States and Americans, etc. And so almost every inch of this place has been traversed. People looking for old sites, trying to place names of current sites to biblical precedents. This is a very difficult thing. So here we don't have that so much. But let's say when you're driving up along and you see a little mound, it's all covered up with trees or whatever. Here we think, oh, it's a nice hill. Even here we don't have many hills. But there's hills sitting out and they're all covered with brush and things like this. And people, like these early explorers, didn't know that they contained sometimes 10 layers of civilizations. But when they came to a place like this with walls above it, they stopped. And they said, this must be the place that Jeremiah mentioned or whatever from the Bible, and here's how we know this, and there's a process they went through. But there's only a couple of instances when these early explorers came by this site, and that's what they noted, and that's it. So there are these catalogs of place names you can look up, and you go and you say, place, place, place. The explorers found these. It says in 1868, a French explorer said, on a hill, it is covered with brush, not inhabited. Moved on to the next one. 1883, two English explorers said it's a heap of stones, walked on by. It was only since 2005 that Sar Ganor is a person, he's the co-director of the site. He was from the Antiquities Department in Israel, and he knows all of his sites in his region, even if they're not excavated. So he watches for fraud and antiquities fraud and tomb robbers and all this other sorts of things. And he said, we're looking for a site for Hebrew University that would match the Iron Age, be close to Jerusalem, and easy to dig, not too much overgrowth, etc. And he said, I'm going to go to that site. And he went around and he just looked without digging, and there was Iron Age pottery all over the place. And he went back to the other director, Yossi Garfinkel, and he said, we need to dig this site. So there was a test pit opened in 2007, and they just did a little bit of a stratigraphy check, and they found, yeah, we got a rich layer of Iron Age. And that's what they were looking for. So they organized actually originally 10 full seasons, and we found so much stuff that we had to stop. And actually, they stopped several years early, because we have uncovered the 25% of this site. That's unheard of. And the reason why we're able to do that is because it's such a shallow site. It's a very nice thing. By the way, the other major sites in Israel that are uncovered, sometimes it's under 10% that are actually uncovered over 10 to 15 years. So this is a big deal. All right, here's a nice little cities list for you that you skip over when you read the Bible. But apparently this crowd doesn't read the Bible. So anyway, I'm kidding. Joshua 15, 35, 37. You have cities lists. Okay? These are cities belonging to the entity of Judah, the tribe of Judah. Okay? Some of the villages, Eshta'ol, Zorah, Ashna, Zanoah, all these others, some of them we found, some of them we don't know where they are. So it's a big deal just because it says this. Where are these places? Now I put the three of them in red. Socho, Azekah were already known. And why do we know that? Because there were inscriptions at those sites that had those names in the city. It's a very, very unusual thing. Very unique thing, very wonderful thing. Now, we assume that there's some logic to this, that they're giving us a list of cities in a geographic sequence. Some of this holds up, doesn't always hold up, but it makes sense to try looking at it that way. That somewhere around, perhaps around Socho and Azekah, we knew those places, maybe some of those others would be found. This is a very small country, by the way. It's very tiny. So some things are not very far away at all. So Sha'arayim was the one we didn't know where it was in 2005. So Eli Smith is an American, was an American. In 1838, he went and he looked for some of these places with his partner, and they devised a plan to go look for these places. In their first season of looking around without digging, because there was no archaeology really then, 1838, they found 35 biblical sites, and they stood up. Okay. So here's the famous story, 1 Samuel 17, David and Goliath. David ran over and pulled out Goliath's sword, then he used it to cut off his head. When the Philistines had heard what had happened to their hero, they started running away, but the soldiers of Israel and Judah let out a battle cry and went after them as far as Gat and Ekron. Gat is the nearest city to the site we're digging, about 6 miles away. And Ekron's not too much further away. These are the Philistine cities. They're going back home after the battle. The bodies of the Philistines were scattered all along the road from Sha'arayim to Gat and Ekron. So you get the sense the battle has taken place. Now, it's not unusual in the ancient world, especially in this part of the world, to have representative battles. So, for example, before this story, you get the massing of the troops. The Philistines are over here on this side of the Elah Valley, and the Israelites are over here on this side of the valley, and they elected one each, and they skirmished. And whoever won that battle, maybe they settled that particular affair and they went on to something else. It wasn't always that they had the battle of the full armies together. That may be what's going on here. But we have another story. We have a theological story about David here that we have to talk about at some point, maybe some other time. Now, the question is, we know where Gat and Ekron are. We know where the Elah Valley is. Where's Sha'arayim? It's mentioned specifically here. That was the question. Here's the chronology when you walk to the site, even today. Luckily, after the work we've done there and the worldwide attention that this site has brought and garnered, the site is now going to be a national park in Israel. So in a couple of years, perhaps, there will be a nice road going there, because the road going there now is not very nice. And you'll have facilities and a ticket booth and souvenirs and all those things. And you'll be able to walk through the city and see all the wonderful excavations. So on top of the site, when you're just walking around, you'll see scattered remains from the Roman period and the Byzantine period. Byzantine were the state Christianity out of Constantinople at the time, or Byzantium. Just below that, we have Hellenistic walls. What's the Hellenistic wall period? Hellenistic period? The Greek period. Alexander the Great and around his time. Then there's a transition period from the Persian to the Hellenistic. We won't be able to go into all this. And then under that is the main layer. Sometimes it's this far underground, sometimes it's this far underground. It depends on where it is in the site. And this is the major city. This is the big city. Big blocks, big construction, organization, big city gates, fortifications, etc. And the building techniques also tell us something about who created the site. They didn't leave signs behind and say who lived where or who created the site, and we don't get a word of that in the Bible. But we do see that it would take more than us organizing ourselves, putting up a few picket fences. This was 6-ton blocks in some cases. So when did David live? How do we know? The first thing we have to do, whether you want to use the Bible or not, is you've got to look at the records we have. Because there is some history between the lines of the Bible. If you can weed out the theology and some of the other things, you're left with something. Depends on how you want to treat it. Saul then probably lived, by biblical chronology, about 1050 or so to about 1025. These numbers change now every year. David ruled somewhere around 1025 to 965 if we take almost at face value that he reigned a very long time, or the typical biblical 40 years. That means a long time. And Solomon, it's accepted that he reigned somewhere around 965 to 930. How do we know that? We know the end date for Solomon, because the Egyptians tell us that 5 years after Solomon reigned, we invaded the land of Israel. So we have some records that we can help back up. That's how we back up some of this stuff. Okay. So the other thing is pottery that we talked about. So important. Now, you go home to your homes here, and if you go to my apartment down the line here, I have in my apartment something I bought yesterday, a jar or something. And also, if you go to my cabinet, I have a 4,000-year-old pottery vase sitting there. So how old is my house? Right? I have books from the 1800s and books I bought yesterday. So it's a very difficult thing. You can't make assumptions based only on what people use sometimes, and this is the case with pottery too. When we're trying to divide between David and Solomon on pottery, they could drink from the same cup. Clearly, they were father-son, right? And we hope Solomon kept some nice things from David, if he gave him anything. So what do we do next? When we're talking about people who lived so close together, and this goes for Saul too, we may, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, when we figure out something else, and we piece something else back together, we may be may have dug up something from the time of Saul. And then that would be great, because to this point we don't have anything about Saul. So who knows? We have to keep, working on things. Now, what you see there above that little measuring stick are the darkest little bits, and those are olive seeds. And we're lucky to have a lot of them. And they're good for a particular reason. Why is that? Carbon dating. Anything that once lived, breathed, grew, is eligible if we have a good sample. So what's a good sample? This particular site, after the Iron Age, after this period of David, 965 or so, we think it went out of use. 975, we think it was destroyed and collapsed, and then nobody came there for 700 years. That's wonderful. That means we have a sealed context. So when we lift everything up and get to that point, and we find really nice stuff like this, it means it's in a safe context. Whatever is associated with that layer, where we have those and we can get a good sample, we have a date to date that layer. So pottery can't do it in this case, but stuff like that can. So the first seeds were sent in for analysis, and they were sent to several different places, because we knew already in Israel or anywhere, when you say, look at the claims are made all the time about archaeology, right? We found something so spectacular. We found the city of David. We found a palace to David. Half the people go, oh, wonderful, and other people go, you're full of, because it's in the Bible. So the Bible is a divisive thing here. So anyway, when the first samples that came back were dated to about 1,025. Then the next season we found more and more and more, and now we have 14 or 16 samples that have been collected over the 7 years, and they all average out to about 1025 or so BCE. That may mean that we have to, if we're associating this with David, that we move David's dates back a little bit. Big deal, 25 years, but in archaeology, moving something on an individual 25 years is a big feat. And okay, so what you see, the lower picture there, and actually it was in 2009, we have at the city gate, dated to the Iron Age period by pottery, they opened up a drain that took water from the city and took it outside the gate, and it ran through, and it was still sealed. So we lifted the stones in that little spot. See what he's about 3 feet long. We just chose by great luck to move the stones off the top of the drain, and right down below were another collection of olive seeds, olive pits. Those were dated to the same situation. Okay. Here's the director, Hebrew University, Yossi Garfinkel, and we'll go inside Caiapha. Right across the valley is Azekah, the one we know, with the site we knew. Again, Azekah here was already known. If you look in this picture, I'm sorry, I didn't bring my thingy. Right up there, you can't really see it very well, especially at your angle. That's Socho. So here we have Socho. We're standing at the site, and Azekah's right there. They're all right by each other. All right, in 2008, the first excavations were conducted around the city gate, because the city gate was still visible without digging. We saw the outlines of it. So they found that the city gate was dated to the year about the Iron Age, 2000 BC or so. And that's all that was done that year, but it was a small crew. You can see here a couple different sorts of building techniques. This is the gate opening here, where the arrow is. You see the large stones? That's the Iron Age construction. 6 to 10 ton stones, all the way around this site. When it was destroyed and then reoccupied, the Hellenistic period, the Greek period, they came in and they had a different sort of gate system that they used. They filled it in, the old Iron Age stuff. They'll reuse stuff if they can. Why not? They had a great firm foundation with these gigantic stones and fortifications. They built on top of it in about 350 BC. But they filled in here. You can see the nice threshold here, and up there too. So that's our gate. So what did we do? We took away the Hellenistic stuff because we're interested in the Iron Age stuff so that we could get a plan of the gate. And so after a lot of work, this is the Iron Age gate. Now it's called a 4-chamber gate. You're inside the city looking out. Their 4 chambers are 1, 2, 3, 4. The chambers allowed probably access for doors. There might have been 2 or 3 layers of doors that opened up. We found sockets at the threshold. There might have been a post with large doors. This was probably several stories high. You just see the foundations here. And those chambers then allowed for troops, storage, judgments, law courts, news of the day, ritual stuff, all kinds of different things happen at a city gate. All right, so then you're looking out towards Philistia, that direction. This was a very picturesque site, by the way, to dig, because it was a very beautiful area. There's the gate with the green arrow in the center after it was reconstructed and cleaned up. And then there were houses or buildings aligned next to the city gate and along the city wall. All right? This is a house at this second room from the city gate. And when you walk down into this particular place, into this particular room by 3 or 4 steps because of the way the site was created, they walked into this particular site, and it's a several-room house or a building of some sort. Now, in 2008, the last few days of that particular season, a high school student working from Hebrew University from Israel was digging in this particular place that I just showed you, in this particular room, and he found a larger piece of pottery. Not unusual at the site because we're finding hundreds and hundreds of pieces every day of pottery. The pottery is put into a bucket, and then it's taken back and analyzed. Now, there are occasions when somebody gets tired at the end of the day and they think, I am so tired of looking at my 10,000th piece of pottery today, that sometimes somebody might just go, you know, I don't want to deal with this because I know I have to wash it later. So I don't want to have to deal with it. Anyway, luckily it went in the right bucket and nobody knew anything different about it. They took it back to the camp, and what we do is we put water in the buckets and they soak while we have lunch and take a siesta. We come and we scrub. Now, this was ink that was on here. So it's a couple of you in the room can say, Valerie and Alex can attest to, when you take the pottery out and you start scrubbing, you're talking to your friend, you know, you're laughing, you're joking, you know, you're just trying to get through, you know, all this pottery. And if you're not careful, in some cases, the ink could go right with it. The reason why we wash it is because we want to find stuff like this. Okay, so it made it through that process, but even then, it wasn't visible. Now it goes to the next stage, which is the pottery reading, where the people in the office will get together and they'll analyze the pottery. We date the stuff that way. Okay, so they record it all and do all kinds of different things. Then a supervisor happened to see a letter in the top corner, and he said, "This looks kind of like a letter." Now your eyes can trick you, because it can sometimes be a root, a bug, something caused a little scratch in this, and you think, it's nothing. All right. Long story short, it made it through all those steps. And because of its odd shape, kind of uniform shape, we have now the oldest Hebrew inscription from Israel, 5 lines. That's monumental. What we usually get on a jar is "this belongs to," or somebody's name, or wheat, or whatever, oil, whatever. We get that sort of thing. This is dated to that same layer of 1025 BC. This was the first full season of excavation. That's what I saw when I came back that year. That made us go there to begin with. They sent it to the United States. So it was in this country. And they sent it to Berkeley, I think, or Stanford, and they subjected the piece of pottery under specific high-speed cameras, and they shot various wavelengths of light at it, and you can see the various layers of light that they did, and they kept piling up the images to the point now where we have what was almost invisible is now those squiggles and lines there. But you see the 5 lines. Now, we don't have time to go into all the other stuff, but a very generous, you must understand this is a very generous translation. Words for sure that we knew we had there were in ancient Hebrew when it's just starting to split away from Canaanite. The word judge, king, king. Orphan, widow, and the telltale sign which tells us that it's actually ancient Hebrew is the verb form do not do. So if you want to sum up the Hebrew Bible, there's a lot of those. Do not do. So there's a particular thing. The first thing that it says there is al ta'as. In Hebrew means do not do. That form, that grammatical form does not appear in Phoenician, Canaanite, Philistine, anything else. So we have Hebrew, finally. And what does it say? If we take the generous translation, do not do it, but worship. Judge the slave and the widow and the orphan and the stranger. Plead for the infant, plead for the poor, and avenge the king's hands, etc., etc. The king in Israel at the early stages was distrusted. Why? And it tells us in the text. What's the king going to do? If you get a king over you, what's going to happen? He's going to tax you too much. He's going to send you to war. He's going to marry foreign wives. Not that that's so bad, but guess what they're going to do? They're going to bring their foreign gods into the land of Israel, which is a bad thing. And the other thing was very strange is he's going to get horses from Egypt. All right, think about Solomon. What did he do? He ended up taxing too much. He conscripted people into forced service, which caused the empire to collapse, partially. He married foreign wives. They brought in foreign practices. And he went to Egypt and bought horses. Now, they're probably talking about Solomon, but actually, this is a problem. The king already was being warned to take care of the people. Because if we're going to go away from the religious covenant and the king is the representative on earth, the king is responsible for the widow, the orphan. In other words, this is like a prophetic text. If you look at Isaiah 1, chapter 1, or 51 or 52, you have very similar language. Not saying it's written by him. This is earlier than Isaiah. But this is not a list of commodities. This is a theological text. This is a warning text. It's a prophetic text. Somebody smart enough and is proficient enough in scribal arts at this point, that also says there's something about an administration. There's a sophistication to the culture now. And you know what? Next year they'll find something else, and it'll be older, and we continue to push back the boundaries. Right now, this is a wonderful find. This is our first year, and we actually were invited back, of course. In 2009, when we did arrive, our goal was to find the second gate. They thought we had a second gate, and our goal in 2009 is Oakland University, was we charged to get to this particular place. Now that doesn't look like a lot of digging, but that was done in 3 weeks. By about 15 people, maybe. We worked really hard. We wanted to answer the question, and I'll tell you why. When I said 2 gates, which is what you should have done, you didn't flinch. Big deal. Why is it a big deal? We'll tell you in a minute here. Opening a new square. So we're digging here, looking for the gate. This is the way it started off. And right where the girl here is, Danielle, is actually digging with the large pick hoe here. She's digging in an area where this other guy, Ben, is walking. And we found out later that we had to dig through about 3 to 4 feet at least of pebbles. In the Roman period, they came and leveled this area off, so we had to take all that out. That took like 4 days or something, and pebbles, 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 pebbles. So we find the telltale signs of how they manipulated the site throughout the ages. So here we are digging, opening new squares. We're inside the city walls. You can see them in the backside there. And we started to see stones like this emerge on the side, and when we were digging down, they just pop up, and you think, well, it's in my way. I want to clean out this. And so we can't move anything out until we know what it is. Because if you take something out, like we wanted to take that stone out because we were tripping over it, we could have taken out something very important. So until we know where the stone is rooted to, or if it's floating, we can't do anything with it. That turned out to be a very important thing. It doesn't look that important, but this is a standing stone, meaning it's a ritual item, and meaning that it's mentioned all throughout the Bible. So we have a biblical-like situation going on here already. Now here's the other gate. It's filled in like the other side. You can see the thresholds. The gate over here is in the green section. The first gate was over there. This is area C, where we were digging and we spent a lot of time and sweat. There we see the hill. Now, area C, 2009. What's the big deal about 2 gates? Why do we associate it with that biblical Sha'arayim? In Hebrew, anybody know Hebrew? A little bit. Sha'ar in Hebrew means gate. The plural for the masculine in Hebrew, you add im or ayim, and it makes it plural. Sha'arayim means 2 gates. Okay, there's the passage we talked about. Again, big deal. Until I tell you that in all of Israel, in all the archaeology we have so far, we have one city that has been found that has 2 gates. This one. Why is that? This is a small site. Bigger cities, much bigger, 10 times bigger cities have 1 gate in the ancient world. Why is that? Because gates are the liminal zone, the place you have to protect. It's also a very sort of sacred place, but you don't want to have more than 1 gate, that we think, because it doubles your problems for defense, or triples, or whatever it is. So we have a very unique place. So circumstantial evidence is starting to pile up, right? We have inscriptions that is written in one that is written in Hebrew. We have the gate here, 2 gates, matching a story set in the Elah Valley against the foe of the Philistines. Gat is right next door. Very interesting thing. The other thing that I don't think I have in here, because I can't show you, is we don't have 1 single pork bone. 30,000, 35,000 so animal bones that we have found here for food, not 1 was pork. Why is that interesting? Now, they're not Jews yet, but that's a very important point. Go across the border, that culture zone across the Elah Valley. Go to Gat, the closest Philistine site to us. Faunal remains, 18% pork. 18% pork. Go to Ekron, up to 23%. Go to Bet Shemesh on the Judah side, 5 miles north of this site, no pork bones. It's very, very interesting. So here's the gate in Area B, first one found, the second one found, same plan. The city was constructed on a single plan at one time and constructed that way. We think what happened is the fortifications are so massive and so well done, and so the walls around the city are so well done and created. And again, no matter what we did here without significant tools or machinery, we here today, I doubt, just with our man and woman power, would not be moving 10-ton stones around. Somebody had the expertise to do that. And the site is not on a huge mountain, but it's up a ways. Then we think what happens is the houses inside were probably made by the inhabitants because they're field stones and smaller stones. So there's a couple-step process here. Here's what the day is like on a dig in Israel, and it's kind of like this in most digs. We were on a bus about 4:30 in the morning. 5 a.m. we're digging. Oh, and I'm sorry, Luke, Valerie, and Alex can attest to this. 7 a.m. we stop and have coffee in Danish. Go back to work. They bring breakfast to the field, eggs, pudding, toast, or not toast, peanut butter and all that stuff. 9:30 we go back to dig. We stop for watermelon break, which is everybody's favorite because it's just more hydration, right? It's starting to get hot at that point of the day. 1 o'clock we end. We go back immediately and have lunch at the dig hostel. We take a little siesta. We resurrect ourselves to wash pottery for a couple hours sometimes. 7 o'clock we have a lecture, 3 days a week. 8 o'clock you have free time. You can't really go anywhere. And you're back up at 4 o'clock. So now, interesting thing, little things can tell us a lot about what time do we start? 7:30? 7:30, yeah. Goodness gracious. Okay. What you see here, the students are holding jar handles, but they have little impressions on them. This is also an indication of state administration, taxation, something like this. How do we know this? Now, they have impressions, and not every jar handle had them on them, but a significant number. We found about 700 of these so far. Well, we're done digging, 700 of these. So in a particular house unit, there may have been a dozen or more, but the rest didn't have this on it. So what we think is, what this was this was either a place where materials were coming from the state, full of stuff, or these jars were set aside at the site to be filled with grain or oil or whatever to be sent to the state. We're not sure why. Well, why do we know this? We don't have any inscriptions because 100 years later or more, they get very specific. They actually say, these jars are for the king. They say that, to the king or for the king. And they're stamped with insignias, or they also say place names. The place Socho, we found a lot of them there. So there's some sort of administration. Some of the more interesting finds include pilgrims' flasks, scarabs, and I have a story. You should be very proud of Alex. This was in 2010? 10. You see on the top left what looks like a stone. Now, when Alex was digging, as we all are digging, when we dig up anything, pottery is very easy to see, even if it's caked with mud and dust and all that kind of stuff, because it sounds different, you feel different, it has a different ting when you hit it, etc. But this looks like a stone, and it was caked with stuff as well. It's very easy when you're digging through tons and tons of stuff to just put it in the bucket that goes to the, to the dump. He was able to see it with his naked eye. This is extremely rare. I would say one in 10,000. And when you turned it over, that was on the underneath. It's a scarab. It's actually published. I should send you that. So this is the thing. We also metal detect. Now, we're not going to find coins. Coins come in very late. We have a Persian period layer at the site, very small, but we have more Persian coins found at this site than all others combined in Israel because we metal detect. And the Persian period coins are tiny, tiny, tiny for the most part. So we found a lot of period coins that will add to our knowledge of this. Now look at this. These are the first coins minted in Israel. And this is the way they look coming out directly out of the ground. Now they're from about 500 BC, 450 BC. What's shocking to you about this for Israel we're talking about, Judah? First coins. They have Greek images all over them. Faces, animals, deities. Very interesting. It doesn't seem that, according to Jewish tradition, they didn't seem to care about those images. They cared about the purity of the silver. That was more of a concern. So we work very closely with Hebrew University, and we have lots and lots of finds, thousands and thousands of pieces of pottery every day. And we wash the pottery, and we look for inscriptions, and then the pottery is read, meaning it's analyzed, counted, tabulated. And this site, because of its association with the inscription and with David and all these other things, and let's face it, we did make some pretty big claims about this site. National Geographic, in the end of December of 10, had a whole issue devoted to the site and King David. They also made a movie, several movies, and we have lots of dignitaries coming through all the time. So we found a standing stones. In 2010, we extended our dig to the other side. We found more units, more houses, and other sites have the similar. Later in Israel's history, have a very similar urban plan. So ours is an earlier version of that. So we get to see too that the tradition of the architecture and the urban planning continued in Judah. That's another indication that this site belongs as an Israelite one. Then in 2010 or 11, I can't remember which one now, we found a cultic center inside the city walls, and we have found 3. And they were destroyed, so a lot of the stuff was left behind, which is a first. Usually Israelite worship from this particular period we see out in the countryside in rural sites, and we don't have a lot of evidence of that because they are rural and they get covered up. This site had 3 cultic centers in the city. And so we found installations, altars, incense basins, and some very strange artifacts that we don't have any parallel, actually. The incense altar is fair enough to determine, but this one on the bottom is a strange thing, sitting on a post or something, but inside are 2 chambers that would allow the mixing of whatever went inside there. And it was inside the cultic center, so they used it for some sort of thing. Nothing we found here goes against biblical religion from the time, including the fact that there were house shrines. Now, if you read the stories about David, he talks about moving the Ark of the Covenant from the countryside to Jerusalem. And where is it sitting for 38 years prior? It's sitting in a house. And when it's brought to Jerusalem for the first time, it's sitting in a house. So apparently they converted houses to worship places. It's very interesting. Dr. Stamps was just here, last month? He was on the dig several years in a row. And we go, as part of our, we don't just make everybody work, although they work hard. We do go on field trips on the weekends, and we go to various places in the country. There's Alex.
Right there in the middle of the black t-shirt.
So there we are at the Western Wall in Jerusalem. There's Alex recreating his find of the century.
I don't think that's actually even the scarab I'm pointing at. I think we
No,
just got a rock
that was the next day. That was when you found it.
Yeah.
All right, so 2011 season, this goes quickly. We wanted to finish exposing the houses and look and see if we had a piazza at the city gate, and just we found so much more. The running joke was, because we had so much stuff, about every year's worth of digging, and a year's worth of digging means a 6-week season, can create about 8 to 10 years of research. So now we're in our 8, 9, 10, 11. We're in our 4th year. We've already got potentially 40 years of research. So the running joke was, don't find too much, which was a joke. The city was destroyed and they left everything behind, which is a really interesting thing. So there was some cataclysmic event. Here's the open piazza that we found, and then there's just more and more stuff coming out. And now what Emily is collecting here is actually a very rare iron spear that was found. And they came out and Israel TV filmed it, and she was on TV that night on the news. It's very interesting. Now, in 2012, we found more weird stuff. You want to find weird stuff, go to a cultic center, right? So here we found a recessed temple shrine model. These are not unusual, but for an Israelite context, this is unusual. The recessed doors have great meaning. We think this is at least 40 years or so before the temple is built in Jerusalem, Solomon's temple. We think that we have uncovered what it might have looked like as a prototype. Maybe. Here's another one, a clay model of a temple shrine, found in the cultic context. What are they trying to say? The deity lives in there? I don't know. But that's not a far stretch because the deity lived in this temple in Jerusalem as well. So here are the two models that were found. We think we have finally deciphered what two enigmatic biblical terms in the biblical text might have meant. We're able to use the artifacts to tell us what it might have meant, because they're imaging here triglyphs at the top. You can see that circled. They look like the Doric columns on top of the Greek pantheon, if you look there, but this is 150 or so years earlier. So they may be triglyphs or beams that ran into the temple. So, again, that's another whole thing. We have no pork bones. Biblical-like inscription written in Hebrew. Israelite religion is conservative, lacks images. We have no statues, we have no fertility goddesses, no Philistine pottery, and the cultic stuff that we can talk about, David and house shrines, etc. All right, so look at this top photo here. There was so much stuff in this particular house that we had two of our students in there working for almost the entire 3 weeks we were there, and they were barely able to stand up because they had to go around the artifacts so much. There was so much stuff in this room. And what my dream is when we go there is that everybody finds something amazing all the time. Now, there are times when certain students get in a place where it's just 6 feet of accumulation and they're just digging and digging and digging. Luke can attest to that. And then we go to different places. Now, let's skip this. Our last season was to address very specific things, because what we were looking for, we had already finished our main objectives. We were looking to finish up one pillared building in Area F, which is Persian. We found a lot of coins there. But on top of the site, it was discovered in the last year that we had a very large administrative building. What I'm showing you here is the area around the pillared building. And we finally got to the floor, and we kept going, and it was just one of those years where you don't find a lot of great stuff except stones. And at the end, that's what we got to. Very exciting, right? And we get to go around now to various places in Jerusalem, and we have a lot of fun. In 2007, at the top, you can see that's what you can see in Area A, where the A sticker is. That's what was above ground. It was a large building, but we didn't know what it was. In 2012 was going to be our last year until we started digging up there, and we said we got to have one more year to figure out what it is, and we did. At the bottom, 2011, you can see how much has been excavated. That's a lot of manpower and a lot of woman power. So we're digging in Area A and 13, very at the top. We thought it was an Ottoman fort or something. Nobody really paid much attention to it until we started digging around. And we found now, to organize your eyes against this, the Byzantine wall was from the Christian period. They cut into the old Iron Age building, but they left one of the walls on the far side. It's the largest wall we ever found from a building in the Iron Age, even outside of Jerusalem, even with Jerusalem. But the wall went on its corner and disappeared into the Byzantine wall. Unfortunately, when we did our final season, What we found was because it was built on bedrock and the Byzantines took some of the stones and they built over the top of it, we don't really know what it was used for. So we did all that work and had a whole extra season. Except we can say it's a very large Iron Age building. So that's really a crude picture. I didn't do that. But there we think it is. So we have test pits. You can see in the circles were dug around the site. We can confirm that the entire site was occupied. And the center part is mostly bedrock, so it was just the administrative part. I'll show you some of the quick pictures of the places we go. On the seacoast, we do manage to have a little bit of relaxing time. We go to the Israel Museum. We go underground Jerusalem and learn how the temple was built. We go shopping. And we go nature hiking. And we eat. In Tel Aviv, we go to the beach. And Jerusalem is the jewel, absolute jewel. This was near a hostel we stayed at on the beach, and it was an old church. Not a national park, just there. Beautiful mosaics. We go camel riding sometimes. Go to the Christian sites. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. An amazing building, by the way. The Dome of the Rock when we can. The Islamic shrine. And other major excavations. All right, I'm going to speed through this. We have lots of different reasons why we call it an important site. And in the end, what we have confirmed is that we have all of these things coming together at about the year 1025 BC. So if David was responsible, he was responsible for something like this. If it was Saul, it was at the very end of his reign, but it can't be Solomon. It's too early for Solomon. So it's Saul or David, and maybe in 10 years you'll pick up a newspaper and you'll say, we've confirmed that it's whoever. Thank you very much.